All right, welcome everyone to this week's seminar. Our presenter today is Rob Griffiths. So Rob did his PhD at Monash University and then a postdoc in clinical neurosciences here in Calgary. He's been foundation director at the Institute of Sport and Exercise Science at James Cook University, director of exercise medicine at Monash University, dean of medicine at Western Samoa. He's created two companies, Griffin Global and Global Kinetics, which are involved in design and commercialization of a monitor for Parkinson's disease. And he returned to Calgary in 2014 to the Human Performance Lab. His research interests are in diaphragm function, monitoring cardiorespiratory states, and high-speed gait. And when he's not doing research, Rob enjoys writing novels, horse riding in the mountains of southwestern Alberta, and I think you saw a few pictures of that as we were waiting to start. And he's also a competition pistol shooter. But today, he'll be telling us about how does the mammalian diaphragm work.
Thanks, Olivia. Let's get rid of that guy and straight into this. So the mammalian diaphragm, I want to talk about how it works. And the first thing is, why might this be interesting? There are multiple reasons, but while you're sitting here during my seminar, you're going to contract your diaphragm about 900 times. And for the 24 hours, it'll be at least 20,000 times. So it's a bit like the heart. It's really worth understanding what's going on when you've got something so critical in one of the two critical pumps of the body, the heart and the diaphragm. From a clinical perspective, there's a couple of areas of interest and why this might be an interesting topic. 1 in 2,500 live births have a congenital diaphragmatic hernia, and they have it to different degrees. And that means that there's a hole in the diaphragm and the abdominal contents can go into the thorax. And if it's bad enough, the lung can't develop. So that's in a fetus that develops. In the survival in severe congenital diaphragmatic hernia is about 15%. So it's present. I've seen a number of them. I've looked at their diaphragms, and I'm going to talk about that by the end of this discussion. Diaphragmatic hernia also happens in adults, usually from blunt trauma. And under those circumstances, it's a medical emergency because you've got your abdominal contents slipping into the thorax and the lung can collapse. And if it's bilateral, we've got no lungs going, so things are not looking very good. Surprisingly, you can have bilateral diaphragmatic paralysis, which is important, but it's less of an emergency. You can get by with bilateral diaphragmatic paralysis and use intercostal breathing using muscles between the ribs. Understanding how the diaphragm works is critical to understanding diaphragmatic hernia. If you think, and I've been in this position, I'm not a clinician, but I've been associated with the surgical procedure trying to correct diaphragmatic hernia. If you're doing surgery on a fetus, you're going to get a fetal baby from the mother's womb. You're going to operate on the baby to correct the diaphragmatic hernia, put it back into the womb so it can continue to develop. You really want to know about the diaphragm before you start operating on it. You really want to understand why that hernia occurred, where it occurred, what you can do to fix it, how it functions. So let's look at a few basics and see if I can work out. Oh, I can do it. And here's the basics, because I'm going to use the basics because they're so good. The basics in diaphragm are so good. Now, this is ancient Greek, but to hear the meeting, we all know who this is.
Diaphragma, from the prefix dia, meaning through, and the verb phragnumi or frasso. They are equivalent forms of the same verb, meaning to close.
So this is diaphragma, and it's meaning to close through. It's a partition, it's a barrier. And in mechanics, I'm going to labour this point because I think it's critical to the whole understanding of our diaphragm. In basic mechanics, a diaphragm is a flexible membrane separating two chambers, fixed around the periphery, distends into one or other chamber as the differences in pressure varies. And typically in mechanical things, that might be in a carburetor or all sorts of little pumps and have little rubber diaphragms. But it's a great definition to keep in mind when you're thinking of the diaphragm. The classical story of the diaphragm in textbooks, I'll look at this one. Here's a classic drawing of a diaphragm with, and I labour the point, all the textbooks have drawings. I don't know whether that's politically correct, and I'm going to be politically incorrect, but these drawings are showing muscle fibres running in to a central tendon in the middle. And this is a picture. Imagine yourself on the abdominal side looking up into the chest to see this image, and that's a drawing from a textbook on the abdominal surface of the diaphragm. Let's go and have a look at the thoracic surface, if I can work out how to do this. There's the thoracic surface beside it. And again, you've got muscle fibres coming in from all around the side, inserting onto what's called a central tendon. And the common description is a dome of thin muscle inserting onto a sheet of amorphous membranous central tendon. I think there's something missing in these drawings. I think they're anatomically incorrect, and I think they're functionally impossible. So there, I put it up to a big stage. So let's go back to the abdominal surface of the diaphragm over here. And this is a human drawing, and we want to compare it. Let's compare it with the photograph of a sheep diaphragm. So the human diaphragm, in reality, has the same features as the sheep diaphragm. I'm still waiting to collect one. That's been a long process. But let me describe here. This is looking from the abdominal surface of a sheep diaphragm. And you've got, these are the ribs and there's the sternum, and the spine is down the bottom here. Yes, you can see that. So you've got muscle fascicles of this is the costal diaphragm in this region. And a muscle fascicle will have its own individual tendon strand running down and joining a muscle fascicle on the crural diaphragm. So this is the crural diaphragm. This has muscle fascicles running like that. And basically, if you follow down this fascicle of the costal diaphragm through the tendon, it'll go straight to this fascicle, and you've got two fascicles talking to each other via a tendon. But there's no doubt that there is no sheet of amorphous membranous central tendon. The tendon strands run from fascicle to fascicle. This is conventional skeletal muscle. The concept of pulling down on a sheet doesn't hold. The muscle tendon construction, basically very conventional. So let's look at the thoracic side. Can I click? Yeah. So classical drawing shows dome thin muscle inserting onto called membranous central tendon. I'm going to just leave that and say why I'm here and why I get interested in this. My interest in the diaphragm started when I was looking at doing a fatigue study on the diaphragm in the days where I used to believe that the diaphragm was like you see there. And it was in situ. I had lambs and I was stimulating the phrenic nerve for the entire diaphragm and adjusting the length by having a plaster cast and a water-filled balloon which would push up on the abdomen and push up on the diaphragm. But I was surprised to see that there was such a strong passive tension in parallel. So I cut out the diaphragm, much the same as you've just seen before. And the muscle looked very pure with little connective tissue. It's really quite nice. In fact, in Australia, we call that skirt steak. And the fascicles fall apart quite readily. But then I turned it over and looked at the other side. And the answer was, now that I knew that I was looking for something, it was staring straight at me. Here I had, and I'll use the words again, a flexible membrane separating two chambers, thorax and abdomen, fixed around its periphery to the ribs with no gaps, descends into one or other chamber, the thorax, as the difference in the pressures in the chambers varies, because the thorax is always under negative pressure. It has to be under negative pressure to keep the lungs inflated. If you lose the negative pressure in the thorax, the lungs and collapse. You don't want that. So I said, this is a sheep, and well, that's a human, you know, much higher class. But in fact, I've seen this in sheep, horse, rabbit, kangaroo, whale, dog, and human. And the only real difference is perhaps the size of the region of central tendons, which is how I now describe it. So you've got a diaphragm that exists here, and it's not drawn in the anatomy textbooks. So we published this diaphragm description, called it the diaphragmatic ligament, because it went covered the entire surface from bone to bone. If we look again at the two surfaces, the membrane, the diaphragmatic ligament on the thoracic surface on the left is very, very clear. So why might the anatomy book drawings miss it? And I'm thinking that if you don't know what you're looking for, then there's a good chance you're not going to see it. And this is known as inattentional blindness. And you're probably familiar, once I describe it to you, of the paper by Drew in 2013. They had 24 radiologists looking for cancerous nodules in lungs. And the 24 radiologists all had the same set of lungs to look at and slides to look at. But the last one, there are about 10 cancerous nodules, and they had to try and recognize them. On the last slide, had a gorilla right in the middle of the picture. And 83% of the radiologists didn't see the gorilla because they were looking for other things. My point is, the anatomists who drew the pictures were probably thinking of the most obvious thing, which is the muscle. Even studies, there's been studies on diaphragm muscle going over 100 years now. And if you read the methods, there's often a single line where they say, we cut out a section of the costal diaphragm, and the first thing we did was remove the connective tissue on it in order to do our studies. And then they used their results to describe how the diaphragm functions, having already removed a key tissue that we will see more about in this talk. So before we go into fine detail, let's not make the same mistake. Let's look at the function of the diaphragm. And I think that there are two main roles of the diaphragm. The primary role is separating the two chambers that we've talked about, the thorax and the abdomen. I've explained the thorax is always under negative pressure. The abdomen is almost always under positive pressure. And I've explained why. Varanid lizards have a non-muscular post-pulmonary septum that allows, again, a negative pressure in the thorax and permits them to function as a lizard aerobically. And it's a non-muscular septum. And they can't exist without it. In diaphragmatic hernia, if you have it bad enough, the lungs collapse, and that's the end of you. And we argue that this role is served by the diaphragmatic ligament, and that it's critical. So as a function of the diaphragm, the diaphragmatic ligament is critical to its function. The secondary role in mammals, because we happen to have one of these things, the muscles attached to the diaphragmatic ligament, It does active inspiration. Clearly, inspiratory muscles are attached to the abdominal surface of the diaphragm, of the diaphragmatic ligament and on the diaphragm. We can exist without it. If you have bilateral diaphragmatic paralysis, you can breathe intercostally. You're a bit of a lizard in the way you behave, but you can exist, but it's not as critical as I would argue the diaphragmatic hernia is, the diaphragmatic ligament is. So if we just look a little bit more closely, diaphragmatic ligament on the left-hand side on the thoracic surface, the inspiratory muscles attached to the abdominal surface, you can see them on the right side, the region of central tendons, which you can see there, and as I call it, the region of central tendons joining costal muscle fascicles directly to the crural muscle fascicles individually. In the live animal, this diaphragm is under constant tension. So I don't do drawings, I give you photographs. The thorax is intact. This is a horse diaphragm, as it says. The abdomen is open, the liver is removed, and the diaphragm is tight. So this is, if you were to open up the abdomen, take the liver out of the way and put your head down there, this is what you see. And it's like being on the inside of a balloon looking out to the walls. Now the lungs, the thorax is closed, and so the lungs are sitting at functional residual capacity. More on that very shortly. In fact, so if functional residual capacity, when this animal is clearly dead, the thorax is intact, the lungs still have air in them, the same as you sitting there now. So before you take your next breath, just stop. Don't forcefully exhale, just stop. And your diaphragm is going to look just like that right now. All right, start breathing again. I want you to be here. So that's under passive tension at this stage. You've got a balance between the elastic recoil of the lung, which wants to be fully collapsed, and the passive stretch of the diaphragm that you can see there. And from the inside, that is really quite taut. On the other side of the diaphragm that you see there is the diaphragmatic ligament. In the horse, it's quite thick. Diaphragmatic ligament is also under tension, but it's under biaxial tension. So it's being pulled in the direction of the muscle fibers. So the muscle fibers you can see running along here. So it's being pulled this way, but it's also being pulled in this way in a hoop stress direction, perpendicular to the muscle fibers. So to look at the passive properties, I put 12 sutures in all of these different species that I looked at. I put them at the beginning and end of a muscle fascicle, and then I put 5 pairs. Now, while it's sitting at FRC, I would put 5 pairs in and I'd make all the measurements at FRC and say, what are the dimensions right now? And then I'd cut that big section out. And then I put it in this clamp setup. I'd have a tendon clamp, the central tendon. I'd have one of those big strips here. I'd have sutures marking beginning and end of the fascicle, and these 5 pairs of lateral dimensions, which get returned to what they were at functional residual capacity, because it's very biaxial. And then I added weights and did a length tension curve that looked like this. So this is length tension curves with and without the diaphragmatic ligament. So here is just one of those segments. I kept adding more weights and measuring the length. Now, because I knew the exact length of the muscle fascicles, I could then, and they're very easy to tease out, and it's stable length when it's passive, stable length all the way along. I could see what the length of the sarcomeres were and what the total length of the muscle fiber was. So I knew how many sarcomeres there were in series. In a sheep, it's about 10,000. So I could just divide the length that I measured by 10,000. I would come up with an average sarcomere length in all the species. And so at functional residual capacity, this animal is sitting at about 3.6 micron. And this is the curve for the segment of the diaphragm, including the diaphragmatic ligament. Then I cut the diaphragmatic ligament off, and I got just the muscular component. And the difference here is the tension that's being supported by the diaphragmatic ligament. And if we look across 4 species, this is n equals 5 for all the 5 species, the diaphragmatic ligament supports about half the tension in the diaphragm at functional residual capacity. And when you take it off, it is highly elastic. Just holding it, it's like rubber in the direction of the muscle fibers and quite a bit stiffer on the perpendicular direction. So if we now look what's happening in the fetus, because we've been talking about fetuses. So here's a fetal sheep at 121 days gestation on the left, and this is an adult on the right, the same sort of curves. This is about 80% gestation. It's 147 days full time. These sheep are, you know, a big sheep is about this big. Well, these fetuses are about this big. So they're really quite small. But the diaphragmatic ligament is completely functional. There's negative pressure in the thorax. The thorax is domed and sucked up into the chest cavity. And it is a diaphragm that descends into one of the or other chamber, the thorax, as the difference in the pressure in the chambers, which is negative pressure in the thorax, develops. So it has a negative pressure. And why does it have a negative pressure? Because if it doesn't, the lungs can't develop. So in the fetus, you have to have a negative pressure in the thorax, or the lung buds just sit there and you don't develop alveoli. So if you have a diaphragmatic hernia in a fetus, and if you've got protrusion of abdominal contents in there and no negative pressure, the lung won't develop. So if you're going to do anything, really, you have to do some surgery in the fetus. This diaphragmatic ligament, some of us would argue, it also is a platform for the inspiratory muscles to grow on. The ligament holds it under stress, so it leads to the correct orientation of the muscle fibers. Because in every other muscle, you've got your limbs setting the maximum length as far as it can go, but the diaphragm isn't like that, it's a dome. And so the muscle fibers don't develop unless they're under tension. And in diaphragms from fetuses that have died with diaphragmatic hernia, the muscle fibers are bundled down the bottom and got no orientation. They had nowhere to go. They don't just develop separately and connect to a central tendon, as is argued in some cases. So the embryology is a little bit confusing, but let's first of all follow this up. This is the 120-day fetus. About 75% of the tension is held in the diaphragmatic ligament. And as development continues to birth and then through to 3 weeks of age, and we get to about 45% in the diaphragmatic ligament, and in the adult, it's about 50%. Tension supported in the diaphragmatic ligament when it's at functional residual capacity. So it's much higher in the fetus. It's got a stronger job to do, and it's the first job that happens. Without that, you haven't got any lungs, and this is happening before you've got muscle fibers. So the muscle precursors then migrate to the, you have in early development, in fact, by 6 weeks in human embryogenesis, the pleuroperitoneal fold develops. It then, muscle precursor cells migrate to the pleuroperitoneal fold, proliferate and radiate around. Now, John Greer in Edmonton showed that as distinct from other people who'd looked at embryology of the diaphragm. But this is a pattern that's totally consistent with the diaphragmatic ligament existing and its development. And the separation of thorax and abdomen, which is essential even in the fetus. In the adult diaphragm, it's highly compliant and highly elastic in the direction of the muscle fibers. And it may change in length by 40 to 50% and still be under tension. Never goes slack in the diaphragm. And relatively stiff in the hoop stress direction. The hoop stress direction is going around this way, so perpendicular to the muscle fibers. So how does the diaphragmatic ligament achieve that? Over the central tendons, this is dual photon microscopy of the diaphragmatic ligament. This is over the central tendons region. Now in dual photon microscopy, these are the same image but with dual photons, I can specifically on the same place either choose to look with one image with collagen or look at it for the elastin. And so it's exactly the same location. And going from left to right in the X direction is the muscle fibers. So the muscle fibers are running this way. In this case, in the central tendons, the individual central tendons are running in the X direction here. And this collagen and elastin fibers are running at mixed angles, which is totally consistent to how you would produce a sphere to have an elastic arrangement. But over the costal muscle fibers, if we take the diaphragmatic ligament there, how can I move this forward again? Here we go. This is diaphragmatic ligament over the top of the muscle fibers. The muscle fibers are now running left to right in the X direction. The collagen fibers are running at 85 degrees to the muscle fibers in the general direction of hoop stresses. And the elastin fibers are running at 74 degrees, which is both completely consistent with resisting hoop stresses. Now, the elastin content here in the diaphragmatic ligament, it is 50% elastin. In the hoop stress direction, the elastin provides compliance first, and then once you get past the elastic compliance early in the elastin, you start to straighten up the collagen, and then you get sort of herniation protection done by the collagen fibers. But the elastin and collagen, interestingly, are in different layers. So this is the same sort of area. The elastin layer is on average about 35 microns thick. The collagen layer is about 32 microns thick. The elastin layer is always on the abdominal side of the diaphragmatic ligament. The collagen is always on the thoracic side of the ligament, and there's about 27 micron of overlap. And that's the case in every single diaphragmatic ligament. The overlap from a mechanical viewpoint helps to prevent the two pulling apart, so it seems to me that I'm advised is a good design. But the reason why the elastin is always on the abdominal side is unexplained. I have no explanation as to why that's the case, but it is absolutely always there. So the primary role of the diaphragm, the ligament, is absolutely vital. It maintains the thorax. We go back to the definition of a diaphragm, a flexible membrane separating two chambers, fixed around its periphery to the ribs, distends into one or other chamber depending on the pressure difference, which is negative pressure in the thorax, is met by the diaphragmatic ligament. It provides highly elastic support in the direction of muscle fibers and protects the diaphragm from hoop stresses and from herniation. The secondary role of the diaphragm is inspiration. Well, this is obvious. This is what we all understand. This is conventional skeletal muscle. The inspiratory muscle attached to the diaphragmatic ligament on the abdominal surface, but it needs to contract over long distances because its purpose is the further down it can pull, the more it can inflate the lung. And the more, when you start to inflate the lung, it's an elastic bag, but the more you inflate it, the harder it gets to inflate, to pull on it. So it needs to actually be able to travel a long distance and get stronger as it does so. So the obvious way to achieve this is to start out at a very long length and get intrinsically stronger as the contraction progresses. So we're all familiar with the sarcomere length tension curve. This is not taken from actin myosin filaments from sheep. this is just a general length tension curve, just to give the idea we're familiar with. During spontaneous breathing, we know that we start breathing at functional residual capacity. And as we've seen across 4 species, that occurs at about 3.2 to 3.5 microns under ordinary quiet breathing. When you're exercising, you can push this out to even further to get to residual volume, but we'll stick with the conventional breathing. Under conventional breathing, with dogs and little radiopaque markers have shown that under conventional breathing right now, your diaphragm can shorten by about 40%. Well, if it shortens by about 40%, that takes it to about 2.1 micron. And then if you give phrenic nerve stimulation, you can get out to a 50% shortening. And so you could come to here, and then you can't go any further, which possibly means that you're bumping against your ascending limb of the length tension curve. So the costal muscle that we're seeing on the diaphragm is functioning out on the descending limb of the length tension curve from the very far end for very good reasons. Most locomotor muscles are thought to operate around optimal length or on the ascending side of the limb. And if they're operating during lengthening contractions in locomotor muscles, when they're being pulled into a region of greater intrinsic strength, whereas the diaphragm, as it contracts, starts off with not much load, and the further it contracts, the stronger it needs to be, and it can do it this way. And the only way it can cover the distance is to start at such a long length and come up. So it becomes intrinsically stronger. So if you're sitting out there at very long lengths, how do muscle fibers achieve that? Because they have an intrinsic passive tension of their own. Titin is a major determinant in the sarcomere of the passive tension. And Prado took 37 different muscles from rabbits and measured the titin size. And so a larger, heavier titin is associated with a more compliant sarcomere and less passive tension. And across the 37 muscles, he found that the diaphragm muscle was the heaviest with the largest titin. And he found it to be about 3,700 kilodaltons. Well, Venus has done these measurements on the costal muscle. And remember the little crural muscle that was down near the spine, that it directly contributes to via those strings of tendon. So they both have about the same titin size, which is at the long length, heavy titins associated with little passive tension in the muscle fibers, which would permit them to operate right out to 3.5 micron. Well, that's while you're sitting here. If you're running hard and you forcefully exhale, that's going to go longer than that. So this deals with the tension in the direction of the muscle fibers, but then we've got tension perpendicular to the muscle fibers. So let's have a look at this. This is taking the strain. When you go, there's about a 75% increase in the length of diaphragm going from length on the bench. So if you cut out that piece of diaphragm and slop it down so it's got no hoop stresses and no stresses in the long direction, it's a length and condition it never meets in real life. But if you do, you get down to a bench length there. And if you stretch it out to about 75%, you get to a length at functional residual capacity. And this is the passive stretch you will get in the diaphragm when you're doing that. And then if you were to forcefully exhale further, you can get to a residual volume. So it actually stretches a little bit further. And now if we were to apply, this is stretching the muscle fiber passively, or the muscle and diaphragmatic ligament in the length direction passively. If you were to now stretch it the other direction as well with hoop stresses. And that happens if I use intercostal breathing and open up my chest. So now I apply a hoop strain. So if I add those strains from 1 to about a 20% strain, that translates into an increase in the stress occurring in the perpendicular direction. Imagine a piece of elastic fabric. If I pull it this way, it comes in that way. If I pull it this way, it comes back in that way, like a sheet of rubber would. And that's exactly what this is. It's like a sheet of rubber. And so by doing intercostal breathing and providing hoop strains, you actually can inflate the lungs a little bit further. To inflate the lungs, diaphragm has to shorten against an increasing resistance of the lung. The costal muscle alone can produce force and shorten, but if the intercostal muscles produce hoop stresses, that will inflate the lung further. And if you have purely intercostal breathing, it won't work unless you've got the biaxial properties of the diaphragmatic ligament. It won't work if you just had muscle, as you saw drawn in the anatomy textbooks. It requires that biaxial structure of the diaphragmatic ligament. So, to summarize, primary function of the diaphragm is to separate the two pressure chambers and act as a barrier and protect from herniation from hoop stresses. And that is achieved by the diaphragmatic ligament. And if we remember the definition that we keep bringing up from mechanics, a flexible membrane separating two chambers fixed around the periphery on the ribs descends into one or other chamber as the difference in pressure in chambers varies. The ligament fits this definition of a diaphragm all by itself. The secondary function to provide active inspiration over a long length is achieved by inspiratory muscles. And contrary to what you read, there is no amorphous central tendon. There's a region of conventional central tendons connecting the fascicles of the costal muscle to the crural muscle. So again, what's the important issue here? Why is this interesting? Diaphragmatic hernias are most likely a defect in the diaphragmatic ligament. But in fact, what they look for is they see a hole in the muscle. Well, that follows afterwards. But I think that the hernia has occurred because of a problem in the diaphragmatic ligament in the fetus. And in the adult, it's the diaphragmatic ligament that's being ruptured by the blunt trauma. And then the muscle fascicles simply don't have much strength in perpendicular direction. And so they just pull apart. Surgery in the region of the central tendons, which does take place, might want to go between the tendons longitudinally and just stitch up the diaphragmatic ligament behind and still get your hand in there if you want to pump the heart, which is something I have been seeing, rather than just cutting across and cutting all of those tendons and then not restructuring them back together again. Elastin is known to fragment with age. That's why old people have floppy skin. If this occurs in the diaphragmatic ligament, it might help to explain some of the impact of age on breathing, because the elastin is 50% of the diaphragmatic ligament, and may contribute to things like emphysema, where you do see fracturing of elastin in other areas. And finally, if I'm going to use this thing 20,000 times a day, I feel I should know something about how it works. Thanks. Now, Walter's not here. Brent, I gather, is online. So please ask questions.
So, yes, please, everyone ask questions. I can get us started. So you mentioned in your introduction and partway through, with bilateral paralysis, the intercostal muscles take over. So what are the complications that come from that, the depressing quality of life, and then I do a follow-up.
Yeah, you're a bit of a lizard. You can function. The cases I read about, people had actually been unwell with this for quite, pardon me, quite some time before they went to the doctor, and it takes time to diagnose it. So they're a bit of a lizard. They can't achieve much, but they can stay alive like that. And then, you know, they may not even be able to treat that. But if you have the equivalent in the diaphragmatic ligament, like if you rupture it, and if the abdominal contents go into the lung, you have no lungs. If it's bilateral, then, well, that's the end of the story.
Just to follow up on the intercostal muscles. Now that you're basically breathing and going to the intercostal muscles, people get things like stress fractures.
These are people with bilateral. I don't know that we have that many of them, so wouldn't know. And I don't know. I guess they eventually they're such a lizard that maybe some people just sit by the telly and can get away with it. But you're not going to be achieving anything, and I don't know. I think you would be going downhill. But it's not an immediate medical emergency, whereas rupturing the diaphragmatic ligament is a clinical emergency. John?
So the horses, when they're running fast, use a visceral pump in their diaphragm where their abdominal contents are, because of the changes in acceleration over the stride cycle, the guts will move and stretch the diaphragm and then pull it back again during the stride cycle. Do you see any differences in those diaphragms in comparison just to the regular plant?
Yeah, that's a good point. The diaphragm musculature is very sensitive to exercise. So if you go into hospital for a couple of weeks, your costal diaphragm muscle will weaken very rapidly. And in fact, and as you get older, if you become older and frail and don't do much, the diaphragm musculature decreases significantly and the diaphragmatic ligament goes very thin and very fragile. But the converse is also true. If you're athletic, then it's all much stronger. And if you look at horses that are running wild, or my kangaroos that are running wild, you have a big, thick, solid diaphragm and a big, thick, solid diaphragmatic ligament. And so they seem to be more responsive to exercise than many of the other muscles, is what I'm understanding is the case. So in a horse, you see it, cut out a diaphragm in a horse and it'll be close to 2 centimeters thick and a very thick layered diaphragmatic ligament on top. But of course, in that locomotor respiratory coupling, you have, when the horse lands with its front feet down and the abdominal contents push against the diaphragm and forcefully give expiration, you've got to stop and think, what would be protecting that diaphragm if you didn't have the diaphragmatic ligament, this big, tough, membranous structure over here going over the entire surface, because it would herniate between the muscle fibers. Alternately, you would have to say, well, the diaphragm muscle would have to be active during expiration just to protect it. So the diaphragmatic ligament is there for a good reason, but it's certainly strong in horses.
I want to try to understand more why you say the diaphragmatic ligament is what produces the difference in pressure. It seems like you have muscles and tendon. Are you saying those do nothing, or are they in parallel, but the ligament does more? Or
yep, I'm going to say there are times in the cycle where your muscle is passive, but if you play with skirt stake, which is the easiest one to get to, which is diaphragm, it's the strands of fascicles, they're easy to pull apart. there's not a lot of, it doesn't need to have structures perpendicular because it's got the diaphragmatic ligament. So if you take the diaphragmatic ligament across, you can open up between there anyway. Something I didn't mention, I'm not sure if I can get back. Oh, yes, I can. No, wrong direction. No. Don't look, that was me on Tom's the Tank Engine. Here, oh, how do I run this? Oh, down there. Right, down in this region, there are gaps. There's several places in the musculature of the diaphragm where there's actually a hole. You can actually poke your finger through there, and sometimes up in these little triangles as well. And it's different a little bit between species. And if you were trying to maintain the negative pressure in the thorax and you had a hole, well, you'll just get passage of stuff. And in fact, it is one of the places where you can get a hernia. But on the other side of this hole is your diaphragmatic ligament. So one, you could push between the muscle fibers or muscle fascicles, and two, there are some gaps in the diaphragm. See, in the horse here, down the bottom here, there are some small gaps here as well. So the musculature just isn't complete, doesn't need to be complete. It's grown up on top of this sheet that was there before the muscles migrated to it to grow.
So I saw you have a picture of a barrel in there, which I think you wanted to illustrate food stresses. So I actually can't remember my mechanics of those things, but I thought there was a pretty simple relationship, like the food stresses to like twice the radial stress, something like that.
Yes.
And so I guess my interpretation is just, well, so muscles are oriented in one direction, and so maybe they do most of the radial, and then maybe you can just passively get away with providing the food stress with the ligament. But then I guess in my mind, I would still think that they share this whole thing of both maintaining pressure between the two, differential pressure, but also, you know, in the case of the muscle, presumably also modulating.
Yes. Yeah. It's interesting. When I first started looking on this, the elasticity in the direction of the muscle fibers was quite astonishing. It was exactly like having a piece of rubber, and elastin has the same Young's modulus as rubber. So it was highly elastic in this direction. And I could see if I pulled it in the hoop stress direction, it was two things. One, it impacted on the other direction. But secondly, you could feel how you got past the elastic bit and then you got into the collagen, and it was very, very strong. In that direction, the diaphragmatic ligament is a very tough membrane. Now, I agree, though, that they are both together. You have the muscle fascicles of the costal muscle and the diaphragmatic ligament, and there are collagen strands that run occasionally between them and link them. So they are actually linked, and to surgically remove it, I have to get in and get the little scissors and snip all of those little strands. So they are intimately together, and 50% of the tension in the muscle fiber direction is supported by the diaphragmatic ligament at functional residual capacity, which of course means the other 50% is in the muscle fibers, where they have a titin that's very large. So, but they can go out to very long lengths before it starts to impact there. So you are correct that there is a component that the muscle fibers must be doing.
I think you also showed the mass of the whole thing, of the whole diaphragm, but you know the breakdown of how much is the ligament and how much is the muscle?
I don't have those numbers because they're very variable between species and they're very variable between behaviors. So if you have a laboratory rabbit which I think should never be used in laboratory experiments because it's always the outlier. But in a laboratory rabbit that's in a very quiet situation, the diaphragm is one of the first muscles to suffer. So it's very thin. The diaphragmatic ligament is thin. And at the other end, you've got horses and kangaroos that are out doing serious stuff, and they're much stronger. So you would have to do a population analysis to answer that type of question.
So I'm just curious what those muscles are doing, and I just thought of something, which is I know a guy who actually developed a method to measure things like length changes in a muscle. It's a technique called sonomicrometry.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, why? I think maybe you wouldn't be interested in this because the argument is that the muscles don't do very much, but I think it would be interesting to try to measure how much work they do.
Yes, I certainly considered that. One of the problems is, and you can't see it on the horse at the moment, but because that's at long length, but as it would start to breathe and come down, the muscle fibers are curved. And so the sonomicrometer measures distance in a straight line. So I seriously considered that. But if the muscle fibers are curved quite substantially as you take a full breath, then the sonomicrometer would be going across the sector and missing the length of the muscle fibers. So your only alternative, and someone has done this, they put them in small little sections of it, but then your errors stay the same, but you've got a smaller signal, and so you may be able to get something from it.
Okay, so just to explain to everybody, Rob is the guy who developed sonomicrometry. That's why it's great too. So anyways, I think this is super interesting, and I think especially interesting are those little anecdotes you gave about what happens, like you lose diaphragm if you're lying in bed and stuff like that. And I think maybe if you could put together all of those tidbits, I think that can point us in the direction of what is useful, right? Because it's clearly adapting a lot to certain kinds of stresses. And then what John was saying about locomotion, just feel like there's some sort of big story there.
There's the adaptive side. First of all, my first thought is, if the anatomy textbooks don't even put it in, that's where I said at the beginning, they're inaccurate and functionally impossible because they just haven't got it. So the first bit is to actually have it recognized in that sense. But you're right, the dynamics of diaphragm in total, including the musculature and the diaphragmatic ligament, and with aging, because I have looked at a human at an autopsy that I was observing for other reasons. I think the person was close to 80, and the diaphragmatic ligament was looked like an old person's skin, and so the elastin had fractured, and so there must be a significant impact on the breathing that's due to the changes occurring in the diaphragmatic ligament. So there's a lot still to be done, yes. And if I can say, there is a lot more to be done, because if you look at the muscle fascicle from the rib to where it starts up here, that's not one muscle fiber. In the sheep, it's 5. And all the way across the diaphragm, the muscle fibers, the muscle fascicles running this way, there are 5 neuromuscular junctions in very neat, tidy lines going along. And I always think, is that one motor unit that has to go into all of them, one nerve that comes and so they all go together and just solves the problem of conduction velocity in the muscle fibers, and so it all contracts at the right time? Or does it play with it and say, well, if I only stimulate this one, I could use the passive properties of the muscle and if I'm a horse and let it get pushed out. And then on top of that, you've got this fascicle in the costal muscle going across in its tiny little tendon, running across to another fascicle in the crural muscle. Well, does it have to be activated at exactly the same time? Is it the same nerve, or are they two different nerves, and what would happen? So there's a lot more to see too. John, you had a question.
No, I don't. I think I have an answer.
Oh, good.
Let's make sure I've got my data correct. So you said in the diaphragmatic ligament that the collagen is on the
Thoracic surface.
the thoracic surface and the elastin is on the abdominal surface.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So if you, elastin is an interesting material like rubber and latex. So if you have it in a tube, the problem is that if you pressurize the tube like a blood vessel even, there's a problem with it having a localized expansion, because there's some parts going to be weaker than the other part. So it's going to expand, but expanding then makes it thinner, which makes the stress goes up, and it goes up until it reaches its limit. You reinforce those vessels or rubber hoses with something around like collagen.
On the
Now,
outside.
in your case, you've got, instead of pressure inside, you've got a negative pressure outside drawing it up. So you would want to have the collagen on the outside of the elastin.
Yes. Yes.
To reinforce it.
Yes. Well, that's good, because I've never been able to think of a solution to that. I'll think more on that. Thank you, John. That's excellent. Venus.
I'm wondering about, so you're talking about the passive properties of the muscle, but we never said anything about the active properties. So do you know what type of myosin heavy chain? I imagine it's slow, but is there a specific type of myosin heavy chain in the diaphragm muscle? And yeah, have this muscle like tested in vitro, like single fibers, where they how much force they produce at different lengths?
There's been an enormous amount of work done on diaphragm muscle. It seems to have been a muscle of choice for 5 decades or so. So there is actually quite a lot of information about fiber types there. But in terms of the passive mechanics, I wasn't seeing that would necessarily contribute, unless you can give me another answer. So there is lots of information on that. But no, I don't. Because I wasn't thinking it applied to the passive properties. Do you think it would?
Because if the muscle is activated and it gets shortened or it gets lengthened, so then there are properties of residual force suppression, residual force enhancement, and yeah, if the myosin heavy chain is too slow or the force produced by it is too low, it could be too low as well, like depending on the myosin heavy chain, like the amount of force, the active force as well.
Yes. Yeah, I'm
just thinking about the active property, because when you think of muscle, you don't think only of the passive properties.
Yes.
You need to think how it behaves actively as well.
Yes. Yeah. Well, my only thought in terms of the active contraction was about the conduction velocities and whether you needed to stimulate in 5 different locations just to get the thing to come together at the same time, or whether you could play with that. So, but I know there's a great deal of literature on that, and in particular, 20 to 30 years ago.
Okay, follow up and then we'll go. It's not really follow up. Okay, anyway, it's not like a question to you, but it's a more general question about titan being so long, and the muscle has to operate at a much shorter length. This means that lots of titan lengths is going to be compressed.
Yes.
And so wouldn't this make a problem with the shortening of the sarcomere when you have a big amount of titan getting compressed? So like, wouldn't this hinder the shortening of the muscle?
What an excellent thought.
In my opinion, when you have a long titan, this means that the muscle operates at long length, so it doesn't need to shorten by much.
Yes, yes.
Just
That's just getting to be baggage as you get in close and blocking it up. That'd be terrific. Let's get a diaphragm and do it. Barry.
Thank you, Rob. Rob is there any evidence of this kind of syndrome that the patients with that use a lot of mechanical ventilatory system and produce this kind of distress in lungs and diaphragm could be related with elastin chains, for example?
Elastin chains, what do you mean?
Or chains in the tissue, in the diaphragmatic ligaments.
Yeah. There is, I suppose you would reach to the literature on elastin in arteries and in skin where there's quite a bit of information. I think it's a little bit more, I think it's actually a bit different in the diaphragmatic ligament to what it is in arteries. You don't have the same multiple layers in different directions. And I suspect that in the elastin filaments that I showed there, the red ones running across, there are lots of little cross ones. So to pull it in this direction, you actually have cross linkages between the collagen and the elastin where they bump up against each other. And so in that direction, it seems to be a little bit more like a fishnet stocking type of thing operating this way, whereas they're more fundamentally aligned in the hoop direction. And so they're, you've got a certain predictable elastin behavior. But going in the other direction, I think fishnet stocking is probably a good example. And I think that's actually how it's operating with crosslinks. I don't know how to recognize crosslinks where they occur. I'm not sure how to get a population of crosslinks, and I'm not sure whether you would imagine, I guess, that with aging, crosslinks might fall apart. So I guess the easiest thing to do is to do some of these passive studies on a range of ages. But as I said, when I saw a very old person, their diaphragmatic ligament looked the same as a saggy bit of old skin. So, but beyond that, I don't have skills.
So you say that the ligament is producing 50% of the passive force?
Yes, when you finish breathing, when you exhale, yes.
Yeah. But the muscle at this length is producing very low force anyway because of the diaphragm. So is this really in terms of how much really force that is?
That's the passive force of the muscle.
Yes,
yeah.
But the passive force of the muscle, because diaphragm is very long, so
yes.
it's very negligible. So 50% of something that is negligible, do you think it's something? Or I misunderstood something.
Yes, it is supporting. Let me see, the negative pressure in the diaphragm, in the thorax, is about -5 centimeters of water, but it's enough to make this picture feel like the inside of a drum. So it does, this feels very tight, but throughout it's -5 centimeters of water on the other side. I see what you mean, that the muscle fibers are going to produce more force, but in fact, if we go beyond functional residual capacity to residual volume, blow everything out. So there's nothing left. And the lungs are at the minimum volume, which is still, I think, 1.5 to 2 liters. You can't go below 1.5 to 2 liters. Under those circumstances, you're pulling the diaphragmatic ligament more. And I think from what I have seen, but not measured specific quantifiably, the diaphragmatic ligament is rapidly getting stiffer and possibly producing more of the resistive force. But in fact, even when it shortens, you never get the diaphragm really, the diaphragmatic ligament, you never get it slack. But you're true, the muscle, the tighten in the muscle means it's not going to have much tension out there. But the tensions it has to deal with is 5 centimeters of water. But the funny thing is, you get there and that feels like a drum. Qualitative assessment.
Great presentation. in the strength and conditioning world, the diaphragm is sort of thought of to like maintain and enhance intra-abdominal pressure.
Yep.
The whole breathing aspect is kind of ignored. And so like in that instance, it sort of works isometrically as the sort of oblique muscles at the core sort of contract and increase that pressure. So to add on to what John was saying, like it's not only the negative pressure on the thoracic side, but also this increase of pressure on the inside.
Yes.
So I was just wondering, like, could that maybe explain why you don't have these herniations during instances of large intra-abdominal pressure? Because if the muscle isn't keeping everything down, but the ligament is, but it's already kind of compressed and you have decreased tension through the elastin.
Yes.
Like why aren't we seeing these herniations just in a deadlift or some sort of heavy lift?
Yeah, in heavy lifting like that, I guess it's going back to Art's idea as well, that the muscle is certainly contributing, certainly in this direction, but not in this direction.
Right.
So the diaphragm actually doesn't, the diaphragm muscles don't just contribute to breathing, they contribute to sneezing, they contribute to vomiting, and for, as you say, in deadlifts and heavy things where you need to have the entire abdomen very tight. So it's not just used in breathing by any means. But if you feel the muscle side, in terms of the longitudinal direction, it can be very, very tough. But the lateral direction, the hoop direction, hoop stress direction, I think you could easily rupture around that. And you're relying on the diaphragmatic ligament, I would think. And as I said, there are also some little holes in the musculature. So you're not going to be able to do anything there but rely on the diaphragmatic ligament. And I'd be interested because in those deadlifts, you can get enormous forces. They can have, I think, systolic pressures of 400 millimeters of mercury. So, you know, there's huge pressures that must be intra-abdominal and supported by the diaphragm pulling down. It'd be nice to be able to go further and put stress measurements on these, yeah. But it's a good demonstration that the diaphragm is more than just for breathing.
Do you have any other questions?
What about Brent? He's supposed to be online.
All right, if not, let's thank Rob again. All right, so next week we'll be hearing from one of our new faculty members, Brittany Edgett. So we'll see you all next week.